From looks alone, this watch should easily cost a few grand, right? Well, what if I told you this fancy piece isn't 5 grand, 2 grand, or even 500 quid for that matter? No, this watch can be yours for closer to 150. Want to find out how? Keep watching. So straight out of the gate, this watch is made by a huge company that you've probably never heard of. The Tianjin Seagull Watch Group, or Sea-Gull as they're known colloquially, was founded in China in the 1950s, making them older than some industry giants like Swatch, Richard Mille, and Nomos, and similar in age to fan favourites Casio. Despite the unusual brand name, Seagull's achieved a lot of success, especially when it comes to mechanical movements. According to their general manager, Seagull's the largest mechanical movement manufacturer in the world, accounting for around 1/4 of global production by volume. Despite this, you probably aren't that familiar with Seagull, as they don't sell a great deal of watches in the Western market. For example, 99% of their tourbillons were purchased by Chinese customers at the time of an interview in 2007. Given the gigantic population of China, such a percentage leads to tremendous sales figures. Many watches containing Seagull movements also don't reference them on the dial, as made in China isn't as marketable as made in Japan or Switzerland. So unlike many other unfamiliar brands that you might find yourself coming into contact with, Seagull actually has a great deal of watchmaking experience, meaning they can produce great products. Arguably their most popular piece is the 1963. The one I have here is a modern version, effectively a reissue of a Chinese Air Force watch called the Project 304, whose final prototype was conceived by the original Tianjin factory in, surprise surprise, 1963. Now there is a caveat to that which I'll talk about later. For now though, let's see what you get for your money. So the watch arrived in a rather generic, clamshell-like box. This packaging is solid enough, though it might vary depending on the seller. Inside is the star of the show, the Seagull 1963. Specifically, this is the more faithful, smaller version, which comes in at 37.3mm in diameter, despite being listed as 38mm on most sites. It sounds tiny, but when you consider the 47.3mm lug-to-lug and the bulbous 13.2mm thickness, the watch wears a bit larger than anticipated. Luckily for small-wristed folk, the lugs do curve down quite steeply, meaning you should be able to squeeze into it. For those after a bigger watch, there are other options available, including larger 40 and 42mm options, though I prefer the proportions of this one, which is more faithful to the original. I'll affiliate link all 3 options in the video description, alongside some cosmetic variants of the Seagull should you want to try something a bit more experimental. All of them have the same movement and comparable performance anyway. As you might expect, the 1963 looks straight out of its namesake era, with a creamy dial, blue and gold accents, and a dial slope to the circumference. It's about as close to a reincarnation of a vintage watch as you can get hold of in this day and age. In some regards, I don't think it's perhaps aged quite as well as some alternative, semi-accurate reissues that have received some minor updates and tweaks. The Hamilton Khaki, for instance, still looks killer today, despite the obvious 50s design cues. The aesthetic here is less familiar, though it is wholly original to my understanding, unlike most modern Chinese brands which pump out lazy copies of the big brands. Personally, I like this classic look, which matches nicely with leather belts and chukka boots, 2 things I often find myself wearing, especially for events. Nevertheless, I appreciate that the gold markers and the red star at the top center could be seen as obnoxious. I think the blue hands complement the yellowy tone pretty well, and legibility is a non-issue given the high contrast. The champagne dial glistens slightly, though I wouldn't call it a traditional sunburst, as there's no directionality to it. Hopefully the footage has captured that part accurately. I'd say it still looks more premium than a standard flat dial, but there are certainly more accomplished options out there. One upside of this watch versus some other Seagull models is that it doesn't have the words Seagull printed on the dial, which could otherwise look pretty peculiar to English-speaking non-watch folk. The 1963 sidesteps this through small Chinese characters at the bottom center. Personally, I wish they just do this with every one of their watches, as I don't think the logo looks particularly good anyway, outside of the strange wording. It's constructed of the industry standard 316L stainless steel, and in the hands, it feels awesome. While it lacks faceted surfaces or a variety of finishes, the glossy look is done to a top-notch standard, and the whole thing is very neatly cut with precise edges, especially considering the retail price. It leaves you with a comforting, weighty feel that makes you feel like you're handling a quality product. I've worn this watch a lot over the last year, yet there are surprisingly few scratches, so the quality of the metal is undoubtedly more than serviceable. It's funny because the sterling watches I reviewed recently, they also had glossy finishes across the surface, but they looked really cheap. There's a subtle but impactful difference with this one. In person, you can immediately tell it's not cheap tat. Also, unlike most watches at this price, which ship with generic or simplistic signed crowns, this one features a distinctive star-shaped cutout with a blasted surround. a small factor that again suggests you're getting a quality product. I've heard that crowns can vary on this watch depending on its origin, so don't be too surprised if yours is different. The pushers here, especially the upper one, have fantastic responsiveness that you just don't get with quartz chronographs. This feeling is primarily because of the movement choice, which I'll cover in due course, and boy oh boy is that mechanical clunk satisfying. If there were any criticisms of the case, it would be that the lugs are a tad long, akin to those in the Hamilton Khaki Mechanical. Like the Hamilton, this watch ships with a pass-through NATO style strap by default, so I suppose the lug design caters to that application. Nevertheless, this watch is far thicker than the Hamilton, becoming even more so with the addition of the double-layered strap. Despite the long lugs, I'd steer down the route of a more standard two-piece band to prevent it from feeling clunky. Most of the stock bands that this watch ships with are rubbish anyway, so if you decide to buy this watch, I just opt for the cheapest configuration possible, and then you'll have more money left over to put towards a decent strap. I'll link some viable options in the video description. The one I've been rocking most of the time is just this brown Barton band. Something else to consider is that these watches don't just ship in different sizes, they ship with different crystals too. The most affordable options are typically acrylic, which is less scratch resistant, but can be buffed with polywatch to remove light scratches. These versions typically have a smaller bezel, along with a more pronounced bubble effect crystal, which protrudes significantly, resulting in a more retro look. The model I purchased is the sapphire crystal one, which offers significantly more scratch resistance for a slight price bump. This option features a more restrained dome and an unexpectedly competent anti-reflective coating that ensures legibility isn't compromised, as can sometimes be the case with sapphire. Honestly, I'd recommend either depending on your preferences. The acrylic model likely weighs slightly less and is more faithful to the original, though I always find myself choosing sapphire when it's available for a non-exorbitant price. Oddly, AliExpress listings often have the acrylic and sapphire models listed under different Zwan numbers. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. They even have different Zwan numbers printed on the dial itself. Now, this word Zwan means jewels, so this information would have you believe that the acrylic model features a movement with 2 fewer jewels than the sapphire version, which ultimately may slightly impact performance. Counterintuitively, both current versions actually contain identical ST1901 movements, with 21 jewels in each. The reference to 19 jewels is simply a homage to the original line of watches produced in the 60s, which featured acrylic crystals and an older 19 jewel movement. Now, the information about these movements online seems a bit messy, but here's what I can gather. The original movement was the ST3, which was a clone of the Swiss Venus 175. The Venus Watch Company was selling its design and manufacturing equipment to raise funds for other projects. Tianjin Watch Factory purchased the rights and began producing modified versions of the 175 with that same machinery. The ST3's descendant, the Seagull ST1901, the one that's inside this watch, is an upgraded version of the same movement, whose beauty is easily visible through the exhibition rear present on this model. This is probably the lowest cost, decent mechanical chronograph movement you can get your hands on. Of course, you can get super cheap, generic Tongji mechanicals. Those are the ones that you'll see in dirt cheap watches on the likes of AliExpress, though those often come with major downsides such as accuracy and noise. They're also rather unsightly. Unfortunately, this ST19 is somewhat symptomatic of the noise issue. Now, it's not nearly as loud as that ridiculous in-house Tongji movement that was inside the Sterling a few weeks back, but in really quiet environments, you will notice it. I certainly wouldn't recommend going to bed with this on your side table unless you find the ticking somehow therapeutic. I appreciate the use of the movement nonetheless, as it's a treat to behold with no automatic rotor to block the view of the arrangement beneath. The bright screws, gears, and jewels, along with the relatively well-done etching on the bridges, help this to look far better than the crude garbage featured in most low-end mechanical watches. If you're new to watches, the visuals are bound to draw you in. Just be aware that this movement type will need hand winding regularly to continue functioning, as there's no battery inside or automatic rotor for that matter. In terms of performance, the power reserve or maximum time between winding for this movement is somewhere between 42 and 51 hours. The accuracy of my unit is a reasonable -7 to -9 seconds per day on average. Still, this isn't nearly as accurate as most quartz or mecha quartz chronographs that you'll find in other watches at this price. So the Seagull shouldn't be trusted for super precise timekeeping. Instead, this movement is here to look elegant at a glance, to feel satisfying to use, and to provide the chronograph hand with a smoother sweep when activated, all of which the Seagull achieves at a crazy low price. For context, a Swiss chronograph with a similar column wheel movement will set you back thousands of dollars minimum. You can get these Seagulls with a swan neck regulator, or gooseneck as I think they call them, for a small additional fee on many AliExpress listings, which allows a watchmaker to finely tune the watch to improve its accuracy. Though I wouldn't say these are a necessity for most buyers, maybe just go for it if you like the look of it. While we're on the subject of price, you you may have noticed something about the cost of these Seagull units. Most of them hover around the $150 to $200 mark, but then a few outliers sit at around $500 and above. What's the catch with this? Are the cheaper ones like this fake? Well, yeah and no. The expensive listings you see on the Seagull official store or on other specialist retailers are usually those produced by the original Tianjin factory. Some years ago, it appears they licensed out a version of the 1963 design to other Chinese manufacturers and began supplying them with proper Seagull movements to use inside. Now, there are some minor cosmetic differences between the official Seagull 1963, the expensive one, and the cheaper unofficial one that I have here. The official version has a marginally lighter dial, 2 lines of text, a sealed case rear, and an unsigned crown. It's also only sold with an acrylic crystal and in the smallest 37mm size, faithful to the original. Other than that, the 2 versions are identical in terms of fit, finish, and performance, at least from what all the YouTube reviewers online have said, because I can't justify splashing out $500 for this watch. The unofficial versions are seemingly made with Seagull's approval too, given that they are the movement supplier. So they're like an endorsed homage? Pretty weird, right? One advantage of this unique arrangement is that the sub-manufacturers are now producing all sorts of variants of this watch, including the size, crystal, and color variants mentioned earlier. While not the most attractive movement on the planet, for the price, I really think it's nice to see the mechanism working away. It's far prettier than the most commonly encountered budget movements without looking garish, so I like the transparent back on the unofficial model. Personally, I'd stick to these. The more expensive model doesn't improve on the basic 3-bar water performance offered by the unofficial ones, so you won't see a meaningful increase in performance in any regard despite shelling out over triple the cost. Whichever you buy, you'll be getting one of the best value watches on the planet that punches well above its weight. All options are linked below, so go explore, have some fun. You can thank me later. For more great chronographs, check out the video on screen next, where I'll delve into some more small chrono options.